My name is Kevin Alderson. I'm a law professor at Boston University. Not the sort of person you would expect to be interested or to be involved in efforts to restore antibiotics, good markets for antibiotics. About 15 years ago, when I first started becoming a professor, leaving the practice of law, I was working on my first large article. And for law professors, we write things that are as long as little books, 100-page articles. And this was for the Yale Journal of Health Policy, Law, and Ethics. And it was focusing on just the conundrum of how intellectual property and drug research and development interact, and how it's really useful for the high-income world. It delivers products that are needed by the high-income world. It functions less well for things that serve people that don't have as much money, because the patent system, really the intellectual property system, money runs through it, and it directs R&D. It's developing 100 pages worth of complex theory and describing how the system works. And one of the key assumptions was that whatever was patented would, at the end of the patent period, 20 years from the moment it first started, less for drugs, simply because it takes time to develop them. Whatever entered the public domain at the end of the patent period was just as useful as what was discovered at the beginning. That was a key assumption, and it works in most things. But I began to think, and actually dropped a footnote in the article and said, that wouldn't be true if the knowledge or the impact of the knowledge was lost over time or through use. For example, antibiotics. That footnote just bothered me, and because the footnote basically said, for one of the most important drug classes in human history, everything I just said could be upside down. Everything that normally worked well in intellectual property might not work in this sector. And so I started to obsess about that, and I read everything I could, and then I began to go to industry conferences. And at some of those industry conferences were the first time that John and I met.
When would that have been that you and I met? I can't even put a date on it anymore.
So it's after 2007, because I think it was at some IDS thing in Boston, and I was already here, I think. So 7 or 8. I could go back and dig through my calendar, but I'm not sure. More than a decade ago.
Yeah. Huh. The time that I start to remember really interacting closely with you was when we really started working together around Drive AB. I think we bumped into each other off and on prior to that, but it was Drive AB 2014 to 2017 that was really the place where we began to do stuff.
Yeah, I think prior to Drive AB, funded by the European Union, the Innovative Medicines Initiative. Prior to that, I think, I would hear you say something in a conference, or I'd read something that you would write, and I'd want to attack it. I would say, wait, that can't be right because of this. And then we talk, and you'd say, well, that's not right, but I don't know why it's not right. And then we'd go off and think some more. And I think quite a few of our first interactions were not exactly, it was more sparks, intellectual sparks. But we persisted, and I was grateful to be invited into Drive AB, to be a participant in that. It wasn't, normal for an academic from the United States to be involved. I was, I think, the only academic from the US to be involved. And it was a very constructive process to have, that group of people to be pounding away at this issue for more than 3 years was transformative, I think, is the way that everybody understands these issues now.
Yeah, there are two conversations that really stand out for me. Times when you and I actually pushed through something that changed the way that at least I talk and think. One of them was when we must have been in Oslo when it happened. We were standing outside the conference room, and we'd been talking about metaphors for antibiotics. And we were talking about, and for a while that we used the idea of antibiotics were like battleships. It's a big thing you want to protect your shores, and you don't really want to use it, but you need to have one. And I recall the two of us standing outside in the hallway, and somehow the idea of fire extinguishers popped up.
And this is one of the things I missed most about COVID is the fact that you can go listen to the speeches at a conference, but you can't have the hallway conversations. And that's the thing I miss the most is the ability for the people who just heard something then to go off and eat a pretzel and talk in the hallway and really make a leap. Because that was an important moment, right? It's a better analogy than battleships or nuclear weapons, the things we were talking about before. And you've really polished that over the past couple of years in a way that I think is making headroom. People can understand that.
Yeah, it's been one of those ideas that has benefited from a lot of debate. And the other one that stands out for me is the conversations we had about the paradox of superiority and non-inferiority trials. Because that's one that you and I have ended up writing a lot about, how to sort of think about why the thing you want, sort of intuitively, superiority is actually not the thing you really want once you understand it.
It's an interesting example because it ties together the clinician, meeting the needs of patients, and finding patients with unmet needs so that you can run a study, and also the legal, FDA, regulatory, and ethical issues that are raised with how you design and implement clinical trials. It's actually something that runs right across, our expertise. And I was resistant to the idea that the only option was a non-inferiority trial and was desperately digging for other ways to do it. And I think over time I've come largely around on this issue, and we're 98% in agreement. Another thing I think that's been helpful that we've done together is thinking through how one would structure a reward to a company that brought a great antibiotic to the market. There's been a lot of back and forth, and we spent 3 years in Drive AB. I think our article that talked about the delinked incentives and how you could assign value to specific things, like it's an oral formulation or it's first, second, third, or fourth in class with a slightly declining value. Other things that a drug developer would know early in the process and would have a sense before they started the first clinical trial whether they could achieve these types of things, things that would be on the product profile. That was an interesting discussion, which ended up in an article, which we've done a couple times. And really, that framework is at the core of the PASTEUR Act, if it becomes law.
And also, the UK pilot has picked that up as well, right?
Yeah, there's elements of that because they're trying to articulate what the value is. The difference is that the UK takes the drug that comes to them and then tries to assess value. Whereas PASTEUR says, dear drug developer, when you're still 10 years away from, FDA approval, if you hit these targets, here's what you'll receive. And so, I like the PASTEUR version. I like them both, but I like the PASTEUR version because it also sends such clear signals to the drug development world, the people that we support at CARB-X, those types of companies could really look at that and say, if I do X, I will get paid Y. Still science risk, right? But it dramatically reduces the economic risk, which could be extremely valuable.
And it levels the playing field. If you can say that you're going to earn X, and X is a pretty good sized number if you achieve Y.
Right.
That's what a new cancer company does. That's what a new company for MS does. It's the notion that there is a reward that can be earned, and then pharma does what pharma does, which is take the technical risk and try to invent the tool knowing that it would have a certain value.
Yeah, the difference is that for oncology or for a lot of the novel treatments that are coming out, there's no government guarantee that there's $1 billion market, but there's $1 billion market,
Yep.
or a $10 billion market. I by email we were talking, I guess last week, and I'm not going to name the company, but a public company. It's got 3 preclinical projects, nothing in human yet, and they're all in a kind of narrow orphan type disease, tens of thousands of patients in the United States, that level, more than $1 billion valuation
Right.
and,
For a clinical company.
right. And there's lots of these companies
Yeah.
that have that. Whereas for $1 billion, that's more than the annual sales of every patented antibiotic across the United States for an entire year. With $1 billion, I think you could buy the whole pipeline.
I think you could, with about a 50% uplift on their share price. You could have all registered antibiotics. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. The difference.
So that means that the market is so misperceiving the value that they think that antibiotics are less valuable as an entire class than a single orphan drug, or not even orphan drug, a single orphan drug company with only 3 preclinical assets. Combining these two, that orphan company with nothing in the clinic is worth more than all of antibiotics combined. So I'm feeling good about that footnote. This is messed up.
you were really seeing pretty deeply there. So over your shoulder, I see the Carbex walking around banner. Do you still teach law at all, or is Carbex all you do? And how did all that come about?
I'm not teaching. I haven't taught in the law school for 2 years. I am going to teach a class next year. So, trying to find time to actually retain that word professor in front of my title. But the university has found other people to teach my classes. I do want to get back in the classroom from time to time, though. It's a wonderful experience, without a doubt.
Okay. But Carbex took over your life in, what year was that?
2016. The BARDA put out the broad agency announcement that this biopharmaceutical accelerator could be funded by BARDA and was looking for applications. It came out on February 15th and it was due by April 15th. And you and I spent some quality time in those 60 days to hammer out that application, which was ultimately successful. But it was the craziest 58 days of my life. I think I didn't start work on it until the 3rd day. But yeah, it's been a roller coaster since then, without a doubt.
So that started in end of 1 September 2016. Was that the day your grant started?
Yeah, it was really July 27th of 16, but then in the next year we reset it to August 1st. So our fiscal year starts on August 1st.
Oh, it starts in August.
So we're in our 5th year now, and we're talking to our funders about additional funding to take Carbex out many years into the future.
How many projects so far?
By the end of the year, I think, or at least by the end of January, we should be over 90. I'd have to go check the website to see where we're at today. There's a number in process from the last public rounds that we announced. We've greatly exceeded every target. There's been a lot of interesting science available out there. You can say thank you right now, everyone should, to NIAID and to the Medical Research Council and different groups, that governments largely and some charities that fund basic research. Because without them, Carbex would have had nothing to choose from. But those companies are starving. At present, Carbex pays 90% of the cost of the effort that we're focusing on, and more of the small companies than I would prefer have difficulty raising the 10% from private funding to keep the project moving forward. Which in a normal market, the government's going to pay, or charities and governments, some of the Carbex non-dilutive nonprofit, it's going to pay 90% of the cost, 9-to-1 leverage.
Yeah.
But they still have trouble because the investors see how messed up the market is at the end, that, you know, a couple of preclinical assets in an orphan company is worth more than everything in antibiotics combined. So we have to fix, it's my conviction, I think yours, that we have to fix the market end in order to rationalize everything through the entire system.
But it has been interesting to see how much energy people have been put into this space. As I recall, at the beginning of CARB-X, the goal in the first year was to have 5 projects funded or some number like that, and
20 by the end of the 5th year. And
so the goal was 20 by the end of the 5th year. Okay.
And we will have exceeded that by 4 or 5 times, depending exactly how far we get. There's been a lot of energy. There were a lot of starving companies with great ideas. How about it that way?
I mean, it is interesting to see how much enthusiasm there is for the space, and if we can only make the downstream stuff, the reward stuff, work. I mean, what's your view on? I was asked recently about the need to support the pre-CARB-X stuff and to interest young scientists in this space. Have you had any conversations about sort of I'm gonna call it the feeder pool for the projects and what we need to be doing to support that on a global basis?
It is a concern. CARB-X accepts applications from academic institutions, but we want to see a product, not just a screening platform or a good idea. So we started Hit to Lead, and most of those Hit to Lead type projects have left the university and on SBIRs or maybe some local funding from the university or something, friends and family, the typical. And so that appears to be working. I don't hear anything other than anecdote that's difficult. The difficult thing recently, I guess, in the past 2 years, is that as the private capital, venture capital has dried up, the early seed and angel investors have also begun to, follow suit and say, well, antibiotics is something we can never make, right? That just trickles back, and so there might be ideas that I wouldn't be aware of that are stuck in a university someplace for the lack of, $150,000 plus an SBIR. They can't get out and get enough data to be able to apply to us. I think if we fix pull incentives at the other end, private capital flows back in because they'll see opportunity. The valuations in all this space are so low that they could get amazing scientific assets for not much. I also want to say that I got something for you. How do you think the sector, in terms of the people's understanding of the need for a pull incentive, how that's changed in the past decade or something for you?
The understanding globally of the need for pull incentives has gone from 0 to being a well-grounded public conversation. I mean, it's not just like it's tenfold or 100-fold higher because the denominator was 0. You really have to recognize that. And in 2009, when the Swedish government had their absolutely groundbreaking workshop, with the title was something like "Innovative Incentives for New Antibiotics." I don't have it exactly right, but it had the word incentive in the title. The Swedish government was talking about the need for incentives for new antibiotics. 2009, and were you at that by any wild chance?
Yeah, I was in Uppsala.
And that's where Bob Gaidos was, and I sat down next to the lady from Pew Trust, and then that led to the Obama White House talking to the Swedish presidency, and that led to TATFAR, and that led to the European Commission. Extraordinary. But 2009, at that meeting, there was, the idea that you might need to support and encourage a pharmaceutical firm was, even then, it wasn't really articulated very well. Just this notion that the incentives, somehow something needed to be done and we weren't getting the drugs we wanted, but the idea that the market didn't work. I don't recall that conversation at that stage of the game. This notion that there was a flat out broken market for new antibiotics, that you couldn't depend on the traditional Chicago School of Economics theories as to why it would bring things forward. Instead, you really had to, and it's actually caused me to learn language that that I absolutely knew nothing about before. I don't actually. You're much more of an economist than I am. You should talk about this. This notion of the characteristics that define a true broken market that requires societal level intervention to fix. That idea, no one would ever have thought that was true of a pharmaceutical agent. And so that to me is the big shift. And now we have the Pasteur Act that explicitly recognizes the need for a government level intervention. The recent EU pharmaceutical strategy talks about the need to do something like pull incentives, across the entire EU. So,
the date on it of 2021. Man, that's a fast date for the EU, this pilot. I mean, they're not playing around.
right. So I'd say that's from 0 to 60 in a decade, or so-called 11, 12 years, 2009 to 2020, 11 years. And that the other part of it is that the conversation is no longer just the techies, because I'm a dyed-in-the-wool nerdy techie. I know that. And that's who was talking to themselves before, back in the early 2000s when IDSA wrote bad bugs, no drugs, and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. But suddenly we have, ministers of finance who are aware of this. We have, lawyer economists who are leading major investment projects. We have all of this, we have the UK and the Pasteur Act doing their things to light this area up.
The AMR Action Fund. $1 billion from the companies themselves saying, here's our last placeholder, and we can try to get 2 to 4 antibiotics to the market, but this is going to fail unless we do pull incentives. And so, we're just telling the world that this is what we need. We couldn't imagine that, even 3 years ago or something.
And we didn't have the language. I mean, and that was, in many ways, that's when I think about what Drive AB contributed, that integral project 2014 to 2017. I've long thought there were two things that came away from it. One was the people who got to know each other. And you sometimes joke about the 2 degrees of Drive AB, and it's not the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, but it's the 2 degrees of Drive AB. Everybody is linked. But I also think the language that got invented is just so, we had the idea of push and pull from Chantal Morel, but we did not use it as effectively as we do now. We really have evolved our conversational abilities there, and the fire extinguishers didn't exist, at least as our metaphor. And then all those papers written by academics and colleagues on both sides of the water that look at the UK AMR review, Lord O'Neill, who unleashed a group of lawyers and economists on the question for the UK government, that really advanced our conversational ability.
Yeah, and I think one thing that is underappreciated is that the O'Neill review had a lot of material to read and to build upon, partially because Drive AB was already a year and a half into the project, or 2 years, I'm forgetting exactly. And so they did an amazing job of pulling that together and putting an economist lens on it all.
Yeah.
And actually, beating Drive AB out, they got their reports and their final report out before we did, because there was only like 5 or 6 of them, and they could charge ahead. But the way that those were interlinked, and that the timing of that was awesome. But you're right. A decade ago or 11 years ago, this was barely a conversation. There was a separate meeting in Uppsala back in 2009. It's like the day after the Swedish princess gave her talk, which I thought was remarkably science driven. I had my predispositions about princesses, crushed because she obviously knew what she was talking about and was speaking without notes. There's a small group that met on this economic incentive question, and we actually ended up putting an article together. But that was the most focused discussion with a larger group of people that I had ever had at that point. Previous to that, it had been like exceedingly small meetings. I remember a meeting at the University of Chicago. It was myself and Ramanan and two lawyers, Anup Malani from the University of Chicago, the dean of the University of Chicago Law School, and maybe one or two other people. It must have been 6 or 7 of us. I'm trying to remember. And this was back when he was at Resources for the Future, and we were talking about they're extending the cure.
Right. It was Lakshminarayan and Malani, the authors, I think. It sounds right. Yeah.
Malani was a professor from the University of Chicago Law School. And just a few of us, trying to think, well, what is this? And what are the solutions? What are the possible solutions, and frame them out. And here we are 13, 14 years later, and there's a lot of consensus, right, on the sort of solutions that we're talking about now. All the way from the public health people, groups like Wellcome Trust or Pew Charitable Trust, the Drive AB Academic Consortium, the European Commission now with their strategy, all sorts of small, medium, and large stakeholder groups from the industry side. But this is not a problem in which we're flailing around not knowing what the answer is. This is a problem that we've worked at pretty hard for more than a decade. And there's still a few things that divide us, but I think 98% consensus on where we ought to go and how we ought to get there. It's just a remarkable achievement. It's one thing to have the Schoolhouse Rock version of how policy gets done. It's another one to actually see the hard work and all the conversations, mostly in the hall, that really move things forward. Grateful to be part of it. Glad to be along for the ride with you.
Yeah. Likewise, and I confess, you may have told me before that you and I were in the same room in Sweden. There were a lot of people there, and I was a complete newbie to that crowd. I mean, it was folks. It was not a place. It was not a conversational zone that I would normally have been in, and so I was just learning faces fast and furious as well. And I don't know whether you and I actually met or shook hands or said hello during that. I kind of don't think so.
I don't remember. I think so.
It's fascinating to look back on that. So,
So conferences can occasionally be really important.
Yes, and we miss them in this era of COVID. Okay, so moving on, let's take a deep dive into some of our favorite slides. Kevin, take it away.
We have some descriptions that originally came from a paper by Claire Rothery, done for the National Health Service from the University of York, thinking about ways in which antibiotics help society. And we've reorganized them to call them STEADY. This is from a paper that John and I worked on together. Spectrum, if you hear often that what we really want is a narrow spectrum agent, because that'll have less impact on the negative parts of bacterial evolution. But a broad spectrum agent will sell more volume. And so if you want a narrow spectrum agent, where's the compensatory value in that? If it's going to sell only 20% of the volume, you can see why companies would never bring it to market. And if clinicians and microbiologists and others say, but it would be valuable to have this agent, we have to find a way to pay for that. And spectrum value would be one opportunity, one example of that. Transmission, we see this with COVID. The best infection is one that never happened. If you cure a patient and they're no longer communicable, you prevent downstream infection. But there's no way for the maker of the antibiotic to get any sort of reward for that downstream infection. Those are externalities that are positive to other individuals, but the maker of the antibiotic can't capture them in any way. Enablement is a huge value. Think about everything that we do in the hospital, everything you do in day surgery, ambulatory surgery, uh, things from cesarean section to knee implants to every type of surgery. Think of oncology, anything that makes the patient weakens their immune system. All of it has the safety net of antibiotics beneath it. Enablement value is hundreds of billions of dollars. It's the infrastructure on which antibiotics are the infrastructure in which all of the modern medicine really rests. And if that foundation crumbles, there's significant value that's undermined. But there's no way today for a novel antibiotic to capture any of that value from oncology or from surgery. Diversity says that if you use a single agent, you drive resistance, selective pressure is higher. It would be better from a societal standpoint if we had multiple options, hedged our bets. It's part of the reason why today we don't have just one COVID vaccine in development. We actually have more than 100. But who's going to pay for that? Well, for the COVID vaccines, the federal government and other governments have laid out billions of dollars well in advance of knowing that the vaccine will work so that we'll get many of them to the market. We've done no such similar effort yet for antibiotics. And insurance value is represented by your fire extinguisher. The idea that what is the value of having it available if we need it? And you and I have talked before about for a COVID vaccine, what was its value in 2019? And the answer would be zero or pretty close to zero. Nobody would have wanted it. What was its insurance value if it had been in existence in 2019? Trillions of dollars. Right. So if you add these up, these are all separate ideas, but you add them up and you realize that the social value of antibiotics is literally hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars. And yet, we're paying so little for them that the companies making them and bringing them successfully to the market are being crushed. That economic wood chipper.
When you think about the acronym and the ideas that it's picked up, spectrum, transmission, enablement, diversity, and insurance, there is so much of this that fits right into the idea of fire departments and fire extinguishers. And it's a metaphor that we just got a lot of mileage out of. If the antibiotic is the fire extinguisher, then the microbiologists and the diagnostic tests are the smoke detectors, and some of the stuff that I think is really subtle, like knowing that the transmission thing. If somebody has a bad infection and I stop it with them and it doesn't run rampant through the ICU, the benefits are enormous, but you can't measure them readily. And I think that's an interesting problem. It's the benefit of in effect, the dog that didn't bark. How do you calculate that? One of the things I like about what the UK team did when they sat down with NICE, the health technology assessor, they thought about all of this. They put some math on it. And they looked at this variety of features. And interestingly, they have told us in writing what they think the correct answer is. And they've done it by the price that they put on the UK pilot project. So in the UK pilot, they said they're going to buy 2 antibiotics for up to 10 million pounds a year for 10 years. So let's just think about it in terms of one antibiotic. One antibiotic, up to 10 million pounds per year for 10 years. 10 million per year times 10, 100 million pounds. Now, turn that 100 million pounds into something on a global scale. Okay, the UK is about 3% of the G20. So let's scale it up by 33. So now our 100 million pounds becomes 3.3 billion pounds. And let's turn that into dollars, call it $4 billion and change. And so this idea that the features here, very abstract, spectrum, transmission, enablement, diversity, insurance, have a real value to a community is wonderful to see numerically. They have said, we think that proportionally this is worth about $4 billion to the peoples collectively of the globe. That's the value of this fire extinguisher. A really good new fire extinguisher has a global value in the range of $4 billion. And that number is interesting because that's the number that has been estimated via other means as sort of in the ballpark for what it would take if a true high-end winner of an antibiotic was worth about that much. That's enough to strongly incentivize the whole ecosystem. Got to know that it's real, got to know what the requirements are, but hitting that number is enough to strongly incentivize the ecosystem and make working on an antibiotic financially similar to working on a new cancer drug. You know, it levels the playing field. This idea that we're pricing the antibiotic, the fire extinguisher, the antibiotic, and we're telling you what features we want. Here they are.
So I think it's really important what you just said, John, that this methodology here is health technology assessment. It's really coming from what is the value to society, and then drilling it down to a single drug, and it's finding a very high global value. And you're right that that's converging on a completely different way to approach this problem, which is how much money would it take for a lean and mean pharmaceutical company, a small company, to take this project and take it all the way through to the point in which they can't take it anymore, and they need to sell to a larger company to commercialize these products globally. I'm doing a lot of work on a model on that second question, and the numbers come up very similar to the numbers that you just described here for STEADI. Very different methodologies, top down and bottom up, but they are converging. The number without a doubt is in the billions, and it's not, it's 2 or 3 or 4 billion, depending on the real impact that drug would have. And so that's important information. When you look at something from very different perspectives and you get similar answers, it gives you more confidence that they were close to something that might be the right answer.
And even though I'm not used to talking about spending $1 billion at a time for a global basis, the economists look at these numbers and say, actually, relatively speaking, that's a reasonable amount on a global level. And it's interesting that, it's not $100 million is not enough, but it doesn't take 10 or 20 billion to get it done. It's actually a number in the low single-digit billions that will light up the field.
Yeah, for the planet in perpetuity. If you think about an asset, if you had a bridge or a series of bridges and tunnels that were $1 trillion asset, right? What would you spend every year to maintain that $1 trillion asset? To keep the tunnel that goes under the English Channel, safe, not wet, right? $1 trillion asset. Well, there's ways to approach how much you're going to spend each year. You're going to spend, single-digit percentages of the total value every year to maintain that asset, depending on what the asset is. If antibiotics, the effectiveness of antibiotics as a class is $1 trillion global asset, right now we're spending less than $700 million a year to maintain this asset. The total spend on branded, patented antibiotics. So therefore, the investment in the next generation, the maintenance effort, it's astonishing. And when you buy an old house, the words you want to listen to carefully from a house inspector are deferred maintenance. You're buying this house, but there's deferred maintenance. The heating plant is the date of it is written in Roman numerals. You're gonna have to replace that, and the roof is old, and the antibiotics as a class is something that we've just neglected for decades, and the bill is coming due. But fortunately, the bill is eminently affordable.
Yeah.
Just need the political will to focus and to do it.
I think I sense an article in that you need to write. I don't think I've ever heard you tell the story quite that way. That's a nice summary.
So I got to finish everything already on my to-do list before I even think about it.
Before I think of something else for you to do. Okay.
That's right. That's right. One of the exciting things about antibiotics and antibiotic coolant centers is that many governments are now really taking this seriously. And what's not on the slide is that in November of 2020, the European Commission came out with a pharmaceutical strategy for Europe that includes an antibiotic pull incentive pilot by 2021. So they've got a year to get this done. You and I wrote a letter in, a comment in as part of that process back in September, I think. And, I have to say that almost everything I could possibly have wanted to see was there in the European strategy. So that's not even listed here. Things move fast. But in England, we talked about the steady values, and they've actually now made the selection for the two antibiotics, although they have to go through a procurement process and a negotiation process to figure out the exact amount of money for each one. It's a subscription, meaning that if England needs 1 unit of the drug or needs 10,000 units, it's the same price. People calling this a Netflix model, whether you watch nothing at all or binge 24/7, like some of our children might during this pandemic. It's the same price, and so that takes the pressure off any need to overmarket. It also importantly gives the company assurance on revenue, even if they didn't exactly time the FDA approval of their drug to the pandemic, to the epidemiology. Sweden has an interesting model. Sweden has not very many of the antibiotics that have been approved in the past 15 years have made it onto the Swedish market until they become generic. Sweden has picked 4 antibiotics to support. It's a relatively small amount of money. It's not an R&D incentive, but it will support market entry into Sweden so that the drug is commercially available in Sweden and a doctor can get it if they need it. Another interesting thing about the Swedish model is that the way it's designed, you could scale it up and make it an R&D incentive. And so there are other countries within Europe, and maybe the European Commission as well, who's interested in seeing whether that's something they can build off of, or if the English health technology assessment model is a different way to try to approach how to implement this. And then finally, you have the United States, the PASTEUR Act and the DISARM Act. The PASTEUR Act takes ideas that, not really directly from an article that you and I wrote, but certainly the idea of let's lay out characteristics of a drug that would be worthy of certain values. And as they are able to tick those boxes, we can talk about this in a moment, they receive an assurance of how much money they would receive once the FDA has approved their drug. They would have a good sense of that much earlier in the drug development process. Because the quality of the drugs will vary and whether they tick the right boxes will vary, the PASTEUR Act lays out $750 million to up to $3 billion per drug. You talked about England's fair share being $130 million or 100 million pounds over 10 years. Here, PASTEUR, the US fair share is articulated at the $750 to $3 billion, also over a decade. This PASTEUR covers all US federal sales, so Medicare, Medicaid, the Veterans Administration, CHAMPUS, DOD, Indian Health Service, the lot. Doesn't cover private health insurance. So the companies still have an ability to make additional revenues off the private side. So it would give a guarantee of revenue. Again, whether the federal government needed 1 dose or 100,000 doses, the price would be the same each year.
It's fun to see the way that PASTEUR and the UK pilot have used a point scoring system to try to look at the value of things. And I think PASTEUR is really cool because it lays out some ideas for features that you as a developer could choose to pursue with your project. And, Kevin and I thought in 2015 and published in 2016 a paper where we laid out an early version of this idea, if you will. And the idea behind this model was that we wanted to allow the developer to be able to do some math way back at the beginning. You've just got the earliest steps in drug discovery. You've got a hit or a lead, and the product that's going to go in demand is 3 or 4 years later, and the registration's not for another 8 or 10 years. But you can make choices today that will be hardwired into your product forever. And what we wanted to do was identify things that couldn't be gamed, there couldn't be any trickery involved. It had stuff that everybody could see and would agree was valuable. And so these were the ideas that we laid out. We said we defined a unit called a base payment worth $200 million for 5 years, just to put a number on it. And then we said, well, you get certain numbers of base points, if you will, for the kinds of pathogens you get. So back then we were thinking seriously about the CDC threat pathogen list. And so we said, you're just hitting any of the CDC threat pathogens was worth one base payment. But if you got an urgent or a serious pathogen, you got incrementally more base payments. If you were the first in a brand new class, you got a base payment for that. But subsequent versions could still be very interesting, but there was an idea for a sliding scale. And similarly, some things like pediatrics, we thought, well, that was one where you might have a cost recovery payment, but you could incentivize for other work on the drug for additional indications, for example. And the value of a base payment in this model, $50 million for 5 years, a quarter of that is about enough to actually pay for doing a serious work to add an indication to a drug. And then oral dosage. And so if you look at the next slide, the idea is that you could, as a developer, say, well, actually what I'm going to pursue is something that's oral, and it's going to be a completely novel class, and I'm going to get a CDC serious pathogen, an urgent pathogen, and just one of the standard threat pathogens, and that collectively is going to be worth 3.75 base points per year for 5 years. A substantial amount of money that I can predict that I would get if I hit my target. And it's a model, and I love that quote from George Box that all models are wrong, but some are useful. But this model prioritized answering questions like, what return is needed to cover the investment? It has to be a pretty good sized number. How do you align R&D with stewardship? You do that by providing a delinked model, and you focus the R&D group on what you want by telling them what it's worth. And we also want to be able to encourage development after initial registration. So these were some thoughts we had back in 2015, and it's actually been really interesting to see them get chewed on and worked up and improved upon as time has gone by, because it is possible to be predictable, mathematical about this in a way that will drive people to do the kind of work you want. What's your read on the political tea leaves? I mean, if you're just to think about, what do we need to be doing in 2021, 22 to help this go forward? And I know that nothing's done until lots of back and forth, but how's this going to move along? What can we do to help it?
But another way of thinking about this question is, how much time do we have if Congress fails to act, right? Or if governments fail to act? What would it take for the whole bus to go off the cliff? And I think that's less than 5 years. The Action Fund has bought some time, but if the Action Fund is 5 years old and has lost everything they've invested,
Yeah.
there's just still no reasonable reimbursement, then I think we really would have had a tipping point. So our best chance in the next 5 years is probably the next Congress. The first year or two of the new administration in DC. I'm not a politician or a lobbyist, but it feels like waiting to the latter half of an administration or the first year of the next presidential administration. This has got to be it. This next 12 months is an important time. The legislation is lined up. I mean, there's tiny things that people still disagree with, but the core of it is agreed to. And motivating Congress in the face of so many other priorities is hard. I think with COVID, telling people we need to have a fire extinguisher for antibiotics and preparedness is a message with more resonance than it probably had 2 years ago. I don't know what you think about how we can raise the salience of this issue in the next couple of years.
It's pushing the conversation at multiple levels. And I'm actually pretty excited about the notion that the AMR Action Fund is a vehicle for both bringing new products to approval, but also for holding everybody's feet to the fire and say, we're going to get these developed, but they won't be available to you unless you do something downstream.
Yeah. And the drug that's never approved isn't available to anyone. But with the prices so low, even drugs that get approved are not showing up in many countries. There's a study a couple of years ago that laid out how many low-income countries in the world don't have, many of the basic antibiotics approved with, or launched within their countries because there's no money to be made from it. But work that you and I are working on right now, even in high-income countries, there's incredible lack. And countries near the bottom of the list would be places like Japan and Canada, who just, despite the fact that these are wealthy countries, members of the G7, it just doesn't make sense for a company to bother launching there very quickly. Which, if they can't launch in Japan and Canada, then these drugs, when will they ever show up in India or sub-Saharan Africa, which is a problem. And it was actually the problem that I started with way back when I was first a professor. How do we, what has to happen with intellectual property law to get drugs to the poorer people without money, who need this innovation? And I was thinking of every sort of drug, not antibiotics at that time. But here we are. Antibiotics are not getting to the people who need them. There's an access problem, obviously in the low-income world, but also in places like Japan and Canada, which I find remarkable.
It is extraordinary.
So we got to focus on working this, and I think of the first meetings were really small, more than a decade ago. Now there's hundreds or thousands of people who understand these issues and are working on them. I think broadening the circle of who understands this, getting outside of the infectious disease bubble, is an important step.
Kevin, this was a lot of fun. It was really great to get to talk to you today. And I look forward to keeping on writing newsletters with you and having other conversations and turning them into journal articles. So until then, stay safe.
Let's keep getting things done.
If you enjoyed the conversation today with Kevin, please know that he's a regular contributor here at the AMR.Solutions website. And you should subscribe so you can be ready when another newsletter appears. Thanks for listening.